The day my son told me not to come to his wedding, he didn't shout. He didn't argue. He said it politely, almost gently, as if he were doing me a favor. "Mom," he told me, standing in the doorway of the small house where I had raised him, "it would be better if you stayed home. The wedding is going to be a certain kind of event, and I don't want anything to ruin it." In that moment, I understood exactly what he meant. My son believed I would embarrass him. But what Adrian Carter didn't know that day was that the quiet old woman he was asking to disappear had spent 40 years building a secret he had never even imagined. And by the time he realized the truth, the entire wedding would already be over. Before I tell you what happened next, let me ask you something quickly. If you enjoy stories about strength, dignity, and the quiet power of women who refuse to be forgotten, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps these stories reach people who might need them more than they realize. Now let me tell you how it all began. My name is Evelyn Carter. I'm 69 years old, and for most of my life people saw me as something very simple, a quiet seamstress who lived in a small house at the edge of town. That wasn't entirely wrong. I did spend decades sewing clothes, repairing jackets, hemming dresses, and making wedding gowns for women who were just beginning their lives. But what most people never realized was that while my hands were busy with thread and fabric, my mind was always planning something else entirely. You see, life forced me to learn how to survive early. When my husband left, Adrian was only 4 years old. I remember the day clearly. The kitchen smelled like burnt toast because I had been too distracted to notice the toaster. My husband stood by the door with a suitcase and a look on his face that told me everything before he even spoke. "I can't do this anymore," he said. He didn't say he was leaving us for someone else. He didn't say he was tired of responsibility. He simply walked away and never looked back. From that day forward, it was just me and Adrian. My son, Adrian Carter, became the center of my entire world. I worked 2 jobs when he was little. During the day, I cleaned offices. At night, I sewed clothes in my living room under a yellow lamp that hummed softly while he slept on the couch beside me. I still remember how his small hand would reach out sometimes while he was dreaming and grab the edge of my sleeve as if he needed to make sure I was still there. I promised myself something during those years. Adrian would never feel poor, even if I had to sacrifice everything else, and for a long time that promise seemed to work. Adrian grew up handsome and confident. Teachers loved him. Neighbors said he had a bright future. When he graduated college with a marketing degree, I cried in the audience while everyone else applauded. I was so proud of him that day I could barely breathe. Eventually, Adrian became very successful. He moved to the city, bought expensive suits, and began working at a large marketing firm where he quickly climbed the ladder. That's where he met Vanessa Blake. Vanessa Blake, my future daughter-in-law, was a woman who looked like she had stepped out of a magazine advertisement. Tall, elegant, perfectly styled from head to toe. She worked as a social media consultant and influencer, which meant she spent much of her life presenting a very polished version of reality to thousands of online followers. The first time Adrian introduced her to me, she shook my hand politely, but her eyes moved quickly around my house as if she were studying a museum exhibit. My furniture was old but clean. My kitchen smelled like cinnamon because I had baked apple bread that morning. I could tell immediately that Vanessa was the kind of woman who valued appearances very carefully. Still, I tried to welcome her warmly. "I'm glad Adrian found someone who makes him happy," I told her sincerely. She smiled, but it was a very thin smile. Over the next 2 years, Adrian visited less and less often. When he did come by, he seemed distracted, always checking his phone, always talking about new clients, promotions, investments, and social events. I understood. Success changes people sometimes. I didn't blame him for building a bigger life. What I didn't realize at first was that his success had slowly begun to make him embarrassed of where he came from. My house, my simple clothes, my quiet life, and eventually even me. The truth is I had been sick for some time. Nothing dramatic at first, just fatigue, a cough that didn't go away, doctor's visits that became more frequent. Treatments that made my hair thin and my hands shake slightly when I tried to thread a needle. I didn't tell Adrian everything because I didn't want to worry him while he was building his career. I thought a mother's job was to protect her child from burdens when possible, but appearances can be deceptive. And sometimes protecting someone means they never learn how to protect you. The day Adrian came to my house to talk about the wedding, I had already suspected something was wrong. He arrived wearing a perfectly tailored gray suit that probably cost more than the car I drove. Behind him stood Vanessa Blake, holding a tablet and speaking quietly with someone about floral arrangements and lighting designs. Apparently, the wedding planner, Olivia Grant, was coordinating every detail through video calls even during family visits. "Mom," Adrian said as he sat down in my living room, "the wedding is going to be a very curated event." Curated event. I had never heard a wedding described that way before. "Vanessa and I want everything to feel elegant and modern," he continued. "Minimalist, clean, sophisticated." I smiled gently. "That sounds beautiful." Vanessa glanced around my living room again. Her eyes paused briefly on my sewing machine, the old wooden one that had paid for Adrian's textbooks when he was in college. Then she looked back at Adrian. "You should tell her," she said quietly. Adrian cleared his throat. "Mom, we think it might be better if you don't attend the ceremony." The room went completely silent. I thought I had misheard him. "I'm sorry," I said slowly. "You think I shouldn't come to your wedding?" Adrian avoided my eyes for a moment. "It's just there will be a lot of high-profile guests, clients, executives, media contacts." Vanessa crossed her arms. "And the wedding has a certain aesthetic," she added calmly. Aesthetic, that word hung in the air like smoke. "I could sit in the back," I said gently. "No one even needs to notice me. I just want to see my son get married." Adrian sighed the way someone sighs when they think a conversation is becoming inconvenient. "Mom, please understand," he said. "You've been sick. The scarf, the coughing, it might make some guests uncomfortable." I felt something in my chest tighten. Not anger, not yet, just a quiet realization. My son believed I would embarrass him. Vanessa stepped closer to Adrian and spoke softly but clearly enough for me to hear. "We can always send her professional photos afterward," she said. "And maybe video footage from the ceremony." Video footage. Like I was watching a stranger's wedding instead of my own child's. I looked at Adrian carefully then, really looked at him. I saw the boy who used to run into my arms after school. The boy who once cried because he thought he had lost the drawing he made for Mother's Day. But the man standing in front of me now looked like someone else entirely. Someone who had learned to measure people by appearances. "All right," I said quietly. Adrian looked relieved. Vanessa nodded as if a problem had been solved. They left 20 minutes later. After the door closed behind them, the house felt very still. I walked slowly to my bedroom and opened the old wooden chest at the foot of my bed. Inside were folders, documents, property deeds, bank statements, 40 years of careful planning that no one had ever known about. Because while the world saw a quiet seamstress, I had quietly been building something else entirely. And the moment Adrian asked me not to attend his wedding, I realized something very important. Sometimes love must teach a lesson. And my son was about to learn one he would never forget. But what I decided to do next would change far more than just a wedding. After Adrian and Vanessa left my house that afternoon, the silence felt different than it had before. Not heavier, just clearer. When people finally show you who they are, something inside you stops guessing. You stop wondering if you misunderstood their words. You stop hoping you imagine the cruelty. Instead, you begin seeing the truth exactly as it is. And the truth that day was simple. My son had asked me to disappear from the most important day of his life because I no longer fit the image he wanted the world to see. I didn't cry. That surprised even me. Instead, I walked slowly down the hallway into my bedroom, opened the wooden chest at the foot of my bed, and lifted out the thick folder that had been sitting there for nearly 20 years. That folder contained something Adrian had never known existed. My real life. Most people thought my sewing work was how I survived after my husband left, and it's true that sewing paid many bills over the years. I stitched school uniforms, repaired jackets, shortened wedding gowns, and mended more broken zippers than I can count. But what people didn't see was what happened after every paycheck came in. I saved, not dramatically. Not with large investments or fancy financial advisors. Just small amounts month after month, year after year. The first big step happened almost by accident. 25 years ago, a small house across the street from mine went up for sale. It was old and badly neglected. The roof leaked. The paint was peeling. Most people in town thought it would eventually be demolished. But I saw something different. The price was low, and I had just enough saved to make a small down payment. I remember standing in front of that house with the real estate agent while Adrian was still in high school. He thought I was crazy. "Mom," he said, "why would you buy a house that looks like it's about to fall down?" I smiled and told him something I still believe today. Because sometimes the things people ignore are the ones worth the most. It took nearly 3 years to fix that house. I replaced the roof slowly, one section at a time, painted the walls myself, learned basic plumbing from a neighbor who felt sorry for me. When the work was finally done, I rented the house to a young couple who needed an affordable place to start their life. The rent payments were small but steady, and those payments began something I never told anyone about. They began my quiet investment life. Over the next 2 decades, I repeated that process again and again. One house became two. Two became three, nothing luxurious, just modest properties where ordinary families could live comfortably. Every dollar I earned went right back into improving those homes or saving for the next opportunity. And little by little, my life changed. By the time Adrian graduated college, the properties were worth far more than the small amounts I had originally invested. The rent payments covered my expenses completely. I no longer needed to sew clothes late into the night to survive, but I never stopped sewing because I liked it, and because I didn't need anyone to know about the rest. I closed the folder slowly and sat down on the edge of my bed. The documents inside showed bank balances, property titles, and investment accounts that would surprise almost anyone who saw them. Over the years, my quiet savings had grown into something significant. A fortune, some people might call it, but to me it had always been something else. A gift. Something I planned to give Adrian one day. I had imagined the moment many times, perhaps on his 40th birthday. Or maybe when he and Vanessa started their own family. I pictured handing him the documents and saying, "I saved this for you so your life could be easier than mine was." Mothers spend years imagining ways to give their children better futures. But that afternoon, sitting there with the folder in my hands, I realized something painful. A gift has meaning only when it is given to someone who understands its value. And Adrian had just shown me that he valued something very different: appearances, status, perfect photographs, and carefully designed events. My illness embarrassed him, my scarf embarrassed him, even the life that had raised him embarrassed him. That realization hurt, but it also gave me clarity. I placed the folder back inside the wooden chest and closed the lid. Then I walked into the kitchen and picked up my phone. There was one person I trusted enough to speak to about what I had decided next. Her name was Margaret Lewis. Margaret Lewis wasn't just my lawyer, she was my oldest friend. We had known each other since we were teenagers working summer jobs at the same grocery store. While I eventually learned sewing, Margaret went to law school and built a respected legal practice in town. But she never forgot where she came from, and she never forgot me. When she answered the phone, her voice was warm and familiar. "Evelyn, honey," she said, "how are you feeling today?" I paused for a moment before answering. "Clear," I said finally. "I'm feeling very clear." Margaret recognized that tone immediately. "What happened?" she asked. I told her everything: Adrian's visit, Vanessa's comments, the word aesthetic, the request that I stay home during the wedding. Margaret didn't interrupt while I spoke. When I finished, there was a long silence on the line. Finally, she sighed quietly. "Evelyn," she said, "I have represented hundreds of families in my career. I have seen children fight over inheritances before their parents were even buried. But hearing your own son say something like that, that's different." I nodded even though she couldn't see me. "Yes," I said softly. "It is." "What are you thinking of doing?" Margaret asked. I walked back into my bedroom and opened the wooden chest again. My hand rested on the folder. "I want to change my will," I said calmly. The silence on the phone lasted even longer this time. Margaret knew exactly what that meant. For years, she had prepared legal documents ensuring that Adrian would inherit everything when I passed away. Every property, every account, every investment, everything I had spent my life building. "Are you sure?" she asked carefully. "I'm sure," I replied. "Come see me tomorrow afternoon. I want to rewrite everything." Margaret exhaled slowly. "All right," she said. "But Evelyn, may I ask one question?" "Of course." "What made you decide this so suddenly?" I looked down at the folder again. For a moment, I thought about Adrian as a little boy sitting at the kitchen table coloring pictures while I sewed beside him. I remembered how proud he looked when he brought home his first school award. I remembered the nights I stayed awake praying that he would grow into a good man. Then I remembered the way he said the word presentation. Because, I answered quietly, sometimes the greatest gift a mother can give her child is the truth. The next morning, I woke up earlier than usual. The sun hadn't fully risen yet, and the house felt peaceful in a way I hadn't noticed for a long time. I made tea and sat by the window watching the empty street. Somewhere in the distance, a bird began singing. I thought about the wedding that Adrian and Vanessa were planning. Olivia Grant, the famous wedding planner they hired, was known for creating events so beautiful they looked like magazine covers. Perfect flowers, perfect lighting, perfect photographs. Adrian would look handsome in his tuxedo. Vanessa would walk down the aisle in a dress worth more than my first car. Guests would applaud, cameras would flash, everything would appear flawless. But appearances can be fragile things. Because sometimes the truth arrives when people least expect it. And when it does, even the most beautiful celebrations can change in a single moment. Margaret Lewis arrived at my house later that afternoon carrying a leather briefcase. She sat across from me at the kitchen table and opened it slowly. Inside were blank legal documents waiting to be filled. "Before we begin," she said gently, "tell me exactly what you want to do." I folded my hands and looked at her calmly. "I want to leave everything I own," I said, "to someone who understands what it means to be forgotten." Margaret raised her eyebrows slightly. "Who?" she asked. I smiled faintly. "Do you remember Grace Haven?" I asked. Her eyes widened. Grace Haven was a foundation in our state that helped elderly women who had been abandoned by their families. Some had nowhere else to live. Others had been left alone after giving their entire lives to people who no longer wanted them around. Margaret leaned back in her chair slowly. "Evelyn," she said quietly, "if you do this, Adrian will inherit nothing." I nodded. "I know." She studied my face carefully. "And what about the wedding?" she asked. I looked toward the window where the afternoon light was beginning to fade. "Adrian asked me not to attend," I said softly. Then I turned back to her with a small, knowing smile. "But sometimes," I added, "the most important moments in life happen when someone shows up anyway." And what I planned to do at that wedding was something my son would remember for the rest of his life. The afternoon Margaret Lewis sat across from me at my kitchen table with a stack of blank legal documents. I realized something strange about life. Sometimes the most important decisions we make don't feel dramatic at all. There's no thunder, no shouting, just a quiet moment where a person finally understands the truth clearly enough to act on it. That afternoon was one of those moments for me. Margaret had already taken out her pen and glasses, the same pair she'd been using for years whenever she handled serious paperwork. My friend Margaret Lewis, my lawyer, and the only person who knew the full story of the life I had quietly built. She looked at me carefully before writing anything. "Evelyn," she said gently, "before we start changing legal documents that have been in place for decades, I want to ask you one more time, are you certain about this?" I didn't answer immediately. Instead, I stood up and walked toward the wooden chest in my bedroom again. The same chest that held the folder containing 40 years of careful planning. When I brought the folder back to the kitchen table, Margaret leaned forward slightly as I opened it. Inside were neatly organized documents, property deeds, rental agreements, savings accounts, investment statements. Margaret had seen these papers many times over the years, but even she sometimes seemed surprised by how much had grown from such small beginnings. 3 houses, she murmured quietly while flipping through the documents. 1 commercial property, the salon investment, and the accounts. She looked up at me. "You've done very well, Evelyn," I smiled faintly. "I never thought about it that way," I said. "I was just trying to make sure Adrian would never struggle the way I did." Margaret's expression softened for a moment. She had known Adrian since he was a boy. She remembered the nights he slept on my couch while I sewed clothes to pay school fees. She knew exactly how much sacrifice had built the life written inside that folder. "And now," she asked quietly. I took a slow breath. "Now I wanted to help someone who actually needs it." Margaret nodded slowly and pulled the first document toward her. "Then let's begin." The room was quiet except for the sound of her pen moving across the paper. State your full legal name, she said, slipping naturally into her professional tone. Evelyn Carter. She wrote carefully, her handwriting neat and precise. And today's date, I told her. She continued filling out the form step by step. Then she paused. Who will be the primary beneficiary of your estate? I looked at the window beside the kitchen table. The late afternoon sun was beginning to settle over the street outside, casting long shadows across the pavement. For a moment, I thought about Adrian again, about the years when he was small enough to sit on my lap while I read him bedtime stories, about the day he graduated college when he hugged me so tightly I thought my ribs might crack. Then I remembered the words he spoke in my living room just days earlier. The wedding has a certain aesthetic. My illness embarrassed him. My presence embarrassed him. His own mother embarrassed him. I turned back to Margaret. Grace Haven Foundation, I said calmly. Margaret's pen stopped moving for a moment. Grace Haven Foundation was well known in our state. It provided housing and care for elderly women who had been abandoned by their families. Women who had nowhere else to go. Some of them had spent their lives raising children who eventually forgot them. Margaret nodded slowly and continued writing. Full transfer of properties, she murmured while recording each asset. Rental homes to be sold with proceeds directed to the foundation, commercial investment transferred, remaining financial accounts donated upon estate settlement. When she finished the page, she looked up again. You're giving them everything? I nodded once. Yes, Margaret leaned back slightly in her chair, studying my face carefully. Adrian will inherit nothing, she said quietly. Not the houses, not the accounts. Nothing. I folded my hands together on the table. He already has something more valuable than money, I replied. Margaret tilted her head slightly. What's that? A chance to learn. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then Margaret turned to the next document and continued writing. Nearly an hour passed while we worked through the details. Every asset had to be listed. Every instruction written clearly enough that no court could misunderstand my intentions. Finally, Margaret placed the last sheet of paper in front of me. This is the final document, she said softly. Once you sign it, the old will becomes invalid. I picked up the pen. My hand trembled slightly from the treatments I had been receiving for months, but my mind felt perfectly steady. I wrote my name slowly across the page. Evelyn Carter. When the ink dried, Margaret gathered the documents carefully and placed them back into her briefcase. Then she looked at me again. What about Adrian? She asked. Does he know you're doing this? I shook my head. No, will you tell him? Margaret asked. I smiled faintly. Not today. Margaret studied me closely now as if she suspected there was something more I wasn't saying, and she was right. Because while we had just finished rewriting my will, there was still something else I planned to do, something Adrian would never expect. The wedding is in 2 weeks, Margaret said. Are you really going to stay home like he asked? I stood up slowly and walked toward the sink to refill my teacup. When I turned back to face her, she could see the answer in my eyes before I even spoke. No, I said gently. Margaret raised an eyebrow. You're going? I nodded. Yes. She leaned forward slightly. Evelyn, you know what kind of event Olivia Grant is planning, right? Olivia Grant was the luxury wedding planner managing Adrian and Vanessa's ceremony. Her events were famous across the region. Perfect decorations, perfect lighting, perfect photographs, everything designed to create the appearance of flawless elegance. I know, I said calmly. Margaret folded her arms. Then you also know Vanessa Blake will not be happy if you show up. Vanessa Blake, my future daughter-in-law, had made that very clear the day she stood in my living room talking about the wedding's presentation. I smiled slightly. I'm not going to cause a scene, I said. Margaret's expression became curious. Then why go at all? I walked back to the table and picked up a small envelope from the counter beside the folder. It had Adrian's name written neatly across the front. Because sometimes, I said quietly, people only understand the value of something after they lose it. Margaret looked at the envelope carefully. What's inside? She asked. I slid it gently across the table toward her. She opened it slowly and read the contents. When she finished, she leaned back in her chair with a long breath. Evelyn, she said softly. Yes, this will change everything. I nodded. I know. Margaret closed the envelope and placed it back on the table. When do you want him to receive it? She asked. I looked toward the window again. The sun had almost disappeared behind the houses now, leaving the street covered in golden evening light. At the wedding, I said quietly. Margaret's eyes widened slightly. You're serious? I nodded. Yes. She stared at me for a moment, then slowly began to smile. Not a mischievous smile, but the kind that appears when someone recognizes a quiet kind of justice. Well, she said finally, closing her briefcase, that's certainly one way to teach a lesson. I picked up my teacup and held it between my hands. For years, I had believed the greatest thing a mother could give her child was unconditional support. But now I understood something else. Sometimes love must also give truth. And the truth Adrian Carter was about to discover would arrive on the most important day of his life. Because while my son was planning the perfect wedding, I was preparing something far more powerful than perfect photographs. I was preparing the moment he would finally understand the cost of forgetting where he came from. And when that moment arrived, there would be no way to take it back. A few days after Margaret Lewis helped me rewrite my will, something unusual arrived in my mailbox. At first, I thought it was just another bill or advertisement. The envelope was thick, cream-colored, and sealed with gold wax, far more elegant than anything that usually found its way to my small house. I stood there on my porch for a moment, holding it in my hands, already suspecting what it might be. Because weddings like the one Adrian and Vanessa were planning didn't use ordinary invitations. They used the kind designed to impress people before the celebration even began. Slowly, I opened it. Inside was a heavy card printed with elegant calligraphy. Adrian Carter and Vanessa Blake request the pleasure of your presence at their wedding ceremony. Beneath those words were the details. The ceremony would take place at a vineyard outside Charleston, a place known for hosting luxury events with sweeping views of rolling hills and white rose gardens. The kind of venue where photographers love to capture perfect moments for social media. I read the card twice, slowly. My son had told me not to come, yet here was an invitation with my name printed neatly across the envelope. For a moment, I wondered if Adrian had changed his mind. Maybe guilt had softened his heart. Maybe he had remembered the years when I stayed awake sewing his school uniforms late into the night. Maybe, but deep down, I knew better. Because a small handwritten note was tucked inside the invitation. The handwriting wasn't Adrian's. It belonged to someone else entirely. My cousin Renee. Renee had always been the kind of relative who appeared at every family event carrying homemade desserts and an endless supply of quiet gossip. Her note read simply, Evelyn, I heard what happened. You deserve to be there whether they like it or not. Sit quietly if you must, but don't let anyone erase you from your own son's wedding. Love, Renee, I smiled faintly. It seemed my absence had not gone completely unnoticed by the family. I placed the invitation carefully on my kitchen table and sat down beside it. The envelope Margaret and I had prepared sat nearby. Adrian's name written neatly across the front. That envelope contained the documents that would reveal everything. The new will, the transfer of my estate, the letter explaining why I had made that decision. I had imagined many different ways Adrian might discover the truth. Perhaps months after the wedding, perhaps years later. But now something about Renee's note made me reconsider, because she was right about one thing. No one should be erased from their own child's life. Not quietly, not politely, and certainly not because they didn't match someone else's idea of perfection. That evening I called Margaret again. My best friend and lawyer answered almost immediately. Evelyn, she said, I was just thinking about you. How are you feeling? Stronger than I expected, I replied. That's good to hear. I picked up the invitation from the table while speaking. Margaret, I received something interesting today. What kind of interesting? I read the printed words aloud. There was silence on the other end of the line for a moment. They sent you an invitation after telling you not to come, Margaret said slowly. It wasn't them, I replied. It was my cousin Renee, Margaret chuckled softly. Renee always did enjoy stirring things up. I leaned back in my chair. Margaret, I've been thinking, that usually means something important is coming next. I smiled slightly. I'm going to the wedding. There was a pause. Not a surprised pause. Margaret had already suspected this might happen. In the envelope, she asked. I glanced toward it again. It's coming with me. Margaret let out a quiet breath. Evelyn, you understand that if you deliver those documents at the wedding, it will create quite a moment. I'm not planning to make a scene, I said calmly. But the truth deserves to arrive while everyone is watching. Margaret thought about that for a moment. Do you want me there? She asked. Yes, I replied. I think it would help if the person delivering the documents was the one who prepared them. Margaret laughed softly. You're very strategic for someone who claims to be just a seamstress. I looked down at my hands, the same hands that had stitched thousands of pieces of fabric over the years. Sewing teaches patience, I said quietly. And patience teaches people how to wait for the right moment. The week leading up to the wedding passed quietly. I spent my mornings drinking tea by the window, watching the neighborhood move through its ordinary routines. Children walking to school, neighbors watering their gardens, delivery trucks stopping at familiar houses. Nothing about the outside world hinted that something important was about to happen. But inside my home, preparations were slowly taking place. I chose my clothes carefully the night before the wedding, nothing dramatic, nothing designed to attract attention. Just a simple gray suit I had worn many times before to church gatherings and community meetings. My scarf was a deep blue color with thin silver stitching along the edges. It covered the thinning hair left by months of medical treatments, but it also reminded me of something else. Strength doesn't always look loud. Sometimes it looks quiet and steady. When Margaret arrived the next morning, she was dressed in a navy suit and carrying her leather briefcase. Inside, it was the envelope. Are you ready? She asked gently. I nodded. I've been ready for a long time. The drive to the vineyard took nearly an hour. As we approached the venue, rows of green vines stretched across the hills under a bright summer sky. White tents had been set up for the reception, decorated with flowers that looked like they had been arranged by artists rather than florists. Luxury cars filled the parking area. Guests in elegant clothing moved across the lawn while photographers captured every detail. Margaret parked the car and looked at me. Last chance to turn around, she said lightly. I shook my head. No, she smiled and stepped out of the car beside me. As we walked toward the ceremony area, I could see Olivia Grant directing staff members with precise gestures. The famous wedding planner looked exactly as people described her, confident, organized, completely focused on perfection. Nothing about this event had been left to chance. That was clear the moment we stepped onto the vineyard grounds. Guests glanced at us politely as we found seats near the back of the ceremony area. Most of them didn't recognize me, and that was exactly what Adrian and Vanessa had hoped for. The ceremony began a few minutes later. Adrian walked down the aisle looking confident and polished in a perfectly tailored tuxedo. Vanessa followed soon after, wearing a dress that sparkled softly in the sunlight. The guests applauded warmly. I watched quietly from my seat. My son never looked in my direction, not once. The vows were long and carefully written. Vanessa cried softly during hers. Adrian smiled for the cameras exactly the way a marketing executive might smile during an important presentation. Finally, the officiant pronounced them husband and wife. Applause erupted across the vineyard. Guests stood. Cameras flashed. The perfect wedding moment had arrived. I remained seated for a moment longer. Margaret leaned slightly toward me. Now, she whispered. I shook my head gently. Not yet. Because the most important part of this story had not happened yet. And when it did, Adrian Carter would finally understand that some lessons arrive when people least expect them. The celebration was just beginning, but the moment that would change everything was only minutes away. The moment the ceremony ended and the guests began moving toward the reception tent, I realized something important about celebrations. From the outside, they always look perfect. People are smiling, music is playing, glasses are raised for photographs. But behind every celebration, there are moments no one expects, moments that reveal who people truly are. As the guests around me stood and began walking toward the reception area, I remained seated for another minute. The vineyard was glowing in the late afternoon sunlight, rows of green vines stretching across the hills like a painting. White roses lined the aisle where Adrian and Vanessa had just taken their vows. Everything looked exactly the way Olivia Grant had promised it would, flawless. Olivia Grant, their famous wedding planner, was already directing staff members toward the reception tent, making sure every detail continued smoothly. Nothing about this wedding had been left to chance. Margaret leaned slightly toward me. This is where things usually calm down, she whispered. The ceremony is over, everyone relaxes. I nodded slowly. That's why this moment matters, I said quietly. In my lap rested the small envelope with Adrian's name written across the front. Inside were the documents Margaret had prepared just days earlier. The new will, the transfer of my estate, and the letter explaining why everything had changed. I held the envelope carefully, feeling its weight in my hands, not because it was heavy, but because of what it represented. 40 years of my life. 40 years of sacrifice. 40 years of love given to a son who had forgotten what it meant. Around us, guests were laughing and walking toward the large white tent where the reception would take place. Waiters carried trays of champagne glasses through the crowd. A small jazz band had begun playing near the dance floor. From a distance, Adrian and Vanessa were posing for photographs near the rose arch where they had exchanged vows. Vanessa looked radiant in her wedding dress, her smile bright for every camera that pointed in her direction. Adrian stood beside her looking confident and proud, greeting guests like the successful executive he had become. They looked like the perfect couple beginning a perfect life. Margaret watched them quietly for a moment. "You know," she said softly, "they really believe everything is going exactly as planned." I smiled faintly. "Yes," I said. "They do." We slowly stood from our seats and began walking toward the reception tent along with the other guests. No one paid special attention to us. Most of the people attending the wedding didn't know who I was. To them, I was just another quiet woman wearing a blue scarf and a gray suit. That was exactly how Adrian wanted it. Invisible, unnoticed. But sometimes the people who seem the quietest are the ones holding the most powerful truths. As we entered the reception area, Olivia Grant was speaking quickly into a headset while directing the catering staff. When she noticed Margaret and me walking through the entrance, she gave a brief polite smile before turning her attention back to organizing the event. Her focus never left the details of the celebration, which made sense. Olivia Grant's reputation depended on weddings like this appearing flawless from beginning to end. Margaret and I found a table near the edge of the tent where we could observe everything happening. The musicians were playing softly now while guests settled into their seats. At the center of the tent stood a large dance floor surrounded by elegant tables covered in white linen and silver decorations. Every chair had been carefully placed, every flower arranged perfectly. Adrian and Vanessa finally entered the tent together to applause from the guests. Someone handed them glasses of champagne as the music grew louder and more celebratory. Vanessa lifted her glass toward the crowd with a bright smile. "Thank you all for being here to celebrate with us," she said happily. Her voice carried easily across the tent. She looked exactly like someone who believed the world was unfolding exactly the way she had planned it. Adrian stood beside her with his arm around her waist. He looked confident, successful, admired by everyone in the room. For a moment, I studied his face carefully. I could still see the little boy he used to be hidden inside the man he had become. But that boy had been buried beneath ambition, pride, and the belief that appearances mattered more than the people who helped build your life. Margaret leaned toward me again. "Whenever you're ready," she whispered. I nodded slowly. Then I stood. Margaret stood beside me, lifting her briefcase slightly as we walked toward the center of the reception area where Adrian and Vanessa were greeting guests. No one stopped us. No one questioned why we approached the newly married couple. Weddings are full of people offering congratulations. One more guest stepping forward didn't seem unusual to anyone. When Adrian finally turned toward us, his smile faded slightly the moment he recognized Margaret. "Margaret," he said, surprised. Then his eyes moved to me. For a moment he looked confused, almost uncertain that what he was seeing was real. "Mom," the word sounded strange coming from him now. Vanessa's expression changed instantly. Her perfect smile tightened slightly when she saw me standing beside Margaret. "What is she doing here?" she asked quietly, though several nearby guests could hear her. I ignored the question. Instead, I looked at my son calmly. "Congratulations, Adrian," I said gently. "Your wedding is very beautiful." For a moment he didn't respond. Perhaps he hadn't expected me to appear at all. Perhaps he thought his request that I stay away had been enough. Finally, he cleared his throat slightly. "Mom, I thought we talked about this." I nodded. "We did." Vanessa crossed her arms slightly, her irritation becoming more obvious now that people nearby were beginning to notice the conversation. "This isn't really the time for unexpected family moments," she said sharply. Margaret stepped forward calmly before I could respond. Don't worry, she said politely. We won't take much time. She opened her briefcase and removed the envelope. Adrian's name written clearly across the front. The conversation around us had begun to quiet as nearby guests noticed the unusual exchange. Margaret held the envelope out toward Adrian. This is for you, she said. From your mother? Adrian hesitated before taking it. What is it? He asked. Margaret answered calmly. Something she wanted you to have on your wedding day. Vanessa looked suspiciously at the envelope. Is this some kind of dramatic gesture? She asked quietly. Margaret simply smiled politely and stepped back beside me. Adrian slowly opened the envelope. As he began reading the documents inside, I watched his expression carefully. First came confusion, then disbelief, then something else entirely. The color slowly drained from his face. Around us, the music continued playing softly. Guests laughed and talked at their tables, unaware that something very important had just begun unfolding in the center of the celebration. Adrian flipped through the pages again as if hoping he had misunderstood what he was seeing. Finally, he looked up at me. His voice was quieter now. Mom, what is this? I met his eyes calmly. The truth, I said gently. Vanessa stepped closer, trying to read the papers in Adrian's hands. What does it say? She asked impatiently. Adrian didn't answer right away, because the words in those documents were only just beginning to sink in. And the moment he fully understood what they meant, the perfect wedding day he had spent months planning would never look the same again. When Adrian opened the envelope and began reading the papers inside, I could see the change happen in real time. At first, his face carried the same confident expression he had worn all day. The smile of a successful man standing in the center of a perfect celebration. But then the words on those pages began to settle in. Slowly, that smile disappeared. His eyes moved back and forth across the documents again, as if reading them a second time might somehow change what they said. The music inside the reception tent continued playing softly, but a strange quiet began forming around us. Guests who had been talking moments earlier started noticing something unusual happening near the center of the room. Vanessa leaned closer to Adrian, trying to read the papers he was holding. What does it say? She asked sharply. Adrian didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked up at Margaret Lewis. My best friend and lawyer stood calmly beside me, her posture straight, her expression steady. She had delivered documents like these many times during her career, but I could tell this moment meant something more to her. She had watched Adrian grow up. She knew the boy he used to be. Finally, Adrian spoke. His voice was quieter now. These documents, they say everything is being transferred. Vanessa frowned. Transferred where? Adrian swallowed before answering. To a foundation. The confusion on her face turned instantly into alarm. What foundation? Margaret stepped forward gently. Grace Haven Foundation, she said calmly. Vanessa blinked in disbelief. A charity? Margaret nodded once. Yes. Adrian flipped through the papers again, his hands trembling slightly now. This can't be right, he muttered. Mom, you said all of this would come to me someday. I looked at him quietly. I did, I replied. At one time. Vanessa grabbed the papers from his hands and scanned them quickly. Her eyes widened as she read the details. You gave away everything? She said, her voice rising. By now the nearby guests had stopped pretending not to watch. Conversations had faded. People were quietly observing the scene unfolding between the newly married couple and the older woman standing calmly before them. Vanessa looked at me with disbelief. Do you realize what you've done? She demanded. I nodded. Yes. Adrian's voice sounded different now. The confidence he carried earlier had been replaced with something closer to panic. Mom, why would you do this? I took a slow breath before answering. Because I wanted to make sure what I built helped people who needed it. He shook his head. But it was supposed to help me. His words hung in the air. Not because they were cruel, but because they revealed something he hadn't yet realized about himself. Margaret spoke softly beside me. Adrian, your mother spent 40 years building those assets. Every decision she made was about creating a better future. Adrian rubbed his forehead with one hand. I know that. I looked at him carefully. Do you? I asked gently. The question seemed to stop him for a moment. Vanessa stepped forward again, her voice sharper now. This is ridiculous, she said. You can't just give away an entire estate like this without telling your own son. Margaret responded calmly. Actually, legally she can. Vanessa turned toward her angrily. Who are you? Margaret met her gaze without hesitation. Margaret Lewis, Evelyn's attorney. That answer silenced Vanessa for a moment. She looked back down at the documents again as if hoping she had misunderstood them. Adrian was still staring at me now. Mom, he said quietly, why didn't you talk to me first? I smiled faintly. I tried to talk to you, I said. Do you remember? His expression changed slightly. When? He asked. I didn't raise my voice, I didn't accuse him, I simply reminded him of something he already knew. The day you came to my house, I said softly. The day you told me not to attend your wedding. Adrian looked down at the ground. Vanessa crossed her arms impatiently. This isn't about the wedding, she said quickly. This is about money, I shook my head gently. No, I replied, it's about respect. For a moment no one spoke. The band had stopped playing entirely now. The quiet inside the reception tent was almost complete. People were watching from every direction, curious about the strange scene unfolding in the middle of the celebration. Adrian looked up again, his voice strained. Mom, I didn't mean to hurt you. I studied his face carefully. For the first time that day, I could see something honest there, regret, but regret often arrives too late to undo what has already happened. I know, I said gently, you didn't mean to. Vanessa shook her head in frustration. This is unbelievable, she said under her breath. You're ruining their wedding day. Margaret responded calmly before I could speak. No, she said, the wedding day already happened. This is just a conversation afterward. Vanessa looked ready to argue again, but Adrian raised his hand slightly. For the first time since the documents were delivered, he seemed to be thinking carefully instead of reacting. Grace Haven Foundation, he said slowly. Why them? I smiled slightly. Because they help women who were forgotten by the people they spent their lives caring for. The meaning of that sentence settled heavily between us. Adrian looked back down at the papers again. So that's it, he asked quietly. Everything is gone, I nodded. Everything that was meant for you. Vanessa let out a frustrated laugh. This is insane. She looked around at the guests watching from nearby tables. Do you have any idea how this looks? I answered calmly. Yes. Adrian closed the envelope slowly. When he looked up again, his expression had changed completely. The confident marketing executive who had walked down the aisle earlier that afternoon was gone. In his place stood a man confronting something he had never expected. Consequences? Mom, he said quietly, is there anything I can say to change this? I held his gaze for a long moment before answering. No, the word wasn't harsh, it wasn't angry, it was simply the truth. Adrian nodded slowly. Vanessa looked stunned, but something inside me felt lighter than it had in years. Because this moment wasn't about revenge, it was about honesty. And sometimes honesty arrives at the exact moment people least expect it. The guests would eventually return to their conversations. The music would begin again. The wedding celebration would continue. But Adrian Carter would never forget the moment he learned that appearances can cost more than people realize. And the most valuable things in life cannot be recovered once they are lost. After Adrian closed the envelope and realized the truth about what he had just read, something inside the reception tent changed. It wasn't loud. No one screamed or threw glasses or made a dramatic scene. Instead, the silence that settled across the room felt heavier than any argument could have been. Guests who had been laughing just minutes earlier now sat quietly at their tables, pretending not to stare while still watching everything unfold. The band had stopped playing completely, unsure whether to continue the celebration or wait for instructions. Olivia Grant, the wedding planner, stood near the entrance of the tent with a headset pressed to her ear, looking both confused and frustrated. For someone whose entire career was built around creating flawless events, this was clearly not part of the plan. I remained standing calmly beside Margaret Lewis, my lifelong friend and attorney. Margaret didn't say anything. She didn't need to, she simply watched Adrian the way someone watches a person finally encountering the consequences of their choices. Adrian was still holding the envelope in his hands. His fingers tightened around it as if he hoped squeezing the paper hard enough might somehow change what it said. Vanessa Blake, his new wife, was pacing beside him now, her carefully styled composure beginning to crack. Vanessa had spent months designing this wedding to be a perfect public moment, one that would look beautiful in photographs and videos shared across social media. But reality doesn't always cooperate with carefully designed appearances. "This is unbelievable," Vanessa said quietly, though the tension in her voice carried through the room. She turned back toward Adrian. "You said she didn't have anything." Adrian looked at her, confused. "I didn't know she did." Vanessa pointed at the papers in his hand. "Well, apparently she did." I could see the realization settling deeper into Adrian's mind now. For years he had believed his mother lived a simple, modest life because that was all she had ever managed to build. He had never imagined that the quiet seamstress who raised him had also been quietly building something far greater, a future meant for him. Vanessa turned toward me again, her voice sharper now. "So this was your plan?" she asked. "To come here and humiliate us in front of everyone?" I shook my head gently. "No," I said, "that was never my plan." Margaret finally spoke beside me. "The documents were prepared days ago," she said calmly. "Evelyn made this decision long before today." Vanessa crossed her arms. "Then why bring it here?" she demanded. I answered honestly. "Because this is the first moment Adrian would truly understand it." Adrian didn't react to the argument between us. Instead, he looked around the reception tent slowly, noticing the guests watching him with curiosity and confusion. The perfect image he had worked so hard to create was beginning to slip. He turned back toward me. "Mom," he said quietly, "I really didn't think you would come today." I nodded. "I know." "Then why did you?" he asked. For a moment I considered the question carefully. The answer wasn't simple anger or revenge. It was something much quieter than that. "Because I wanted to see you happy," I said gently. Adrian looked surprised by that answer. "Even after what I said to you?" he asked. I smiled slightly. "You're still my son?" The words seemed to land heavily in the air between us. Vanessa shook her head again, clearly growing more irritated by the situation. "This whole thing is ridiculous," she muttered. "People are staring." At a nearby table, I noticed a group of guests whispering quietly among themselves. News spreads quickly in a room full of curious people. Olivia Grant finally stepped forward from the edge of the reception tent, her professional composure returning as she approached us. "Is everything all right here?" she asked politely. Her voice carried the calm tone of someone trying to restore order to a situation that had drifted far outside the schedule she had carefully prepared. Adrian exhaled slowly. "It's fine," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. Olivia glanced briefly at me, then at Margaret, and finally back at Adrian. "If you're ready," she said, "the band can begin the first dance." The first dance. The moment that usually marks the beginning of the celebration. Adrian looked down at the envelope again before responding. "Give us a few minutes," he said quietly. Olivia nodded politely and stepped back, signaling to the band to remain paused for now. The tent returned to that strange quiet again. Vanessa leaned closer to Adrian, speaking in a low voice that was meant to be private but still carried hints of frustration. "You need to fix this," she whispered. Adrian looked exhausted now. "Fix what?" he asked. "This situation," Vanessa replied. "Talk to her." He looked at me again. "Mom, if I had known—" His sentence trailed off. Because he didn't know how to finish it. If he had known about the money, if he had known about the properties, if he had known that the quiet woman he was ashamed of had been building a future meant for him, I saved him the trouble of guessing. "If you had known what?" I asked gently. Adrian hesitated. "That you had all of this," he admitted. I nodded slowly. "That's exactly the point." Vanessa's expression hardened again. "So this was a lesson?" she said sharply. I shook my head. "No," I paused before finishing my thought. "It was a decision." Adrian rubbed his forehead with one hand. "Mom, I'm sorry," he said quietly. I studied his face carefully. For the first time that day, I could see something real behind his words. Not embarrassment, not pride, just regret. But regret is a strange thing. Sometimes it arrives only after the moment when it could have changed everything. Margaret placed a gentle hand on my arm. She knew me well enough to understand that the most important part of this moment had already happened. The truth had been spoken. Adrian looked up again. "What happens now?" he asked quietly. I glanced around the reception tent once more. The decorations were still beautiful, the flowers still perfect, the guests still dressed elegantly for the celebration. But the atmosphere had changed completely. The perfect image was gone. Now, I said calmly, you enjoy your wedding. Vanessa blinked in disbelief. That's it? She asked. I nodded. Yes. Margaret closed her briefcase beside me. Our work here is finished, she said quietly. Adrian looked like he wanted to say something else, but no words came. I turned toward the exit of the tent, Margaret walking beside me. Behind us, the band slowly began playing again as the celebration cautiously resumed. But Adrian Carter would never look at this day the same way again. Because sometimes the most important lessons in life arrive during the moments we think are supposed to be perfect. And when they do, no amount of planning can prevent the truth from being seen. As Margaret and I walked out of the reception tent, I could hear the band slowly starting their music again behind us. The celebration was continuing, just as I had told Adrian it should. Glasses clinked, people began talking again, and the wedding staff moved quickly to restore the perfect atmosphere Olivia Grant had planned so carefully. But I knew something about that day had changed forever. Not the decorations. Not the photographs. Not even the marriage that had just taken place. What had changed was something much quieter. Adrian Carter would never again see his mother the way he had before. Margaret and I walked slowly toward the parking area at the edge of the vineyard. The evening sun was beginning to dip behind the hills, casting long golden shadows across the rows of vines. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Finally, Margaret looked at me and smiled gently. How do you feel? She asked. I thought about that question carefully. My chest felt lighter than it had in years, but not because I had taken something away from my son. It was lighter because I had finally spoken the truth without anger. Peaceful, I said quietly. Margaret nodded. You handled that with more grace than most people would have. I laughed softly. I spent 40 years sewing delicate fabric, I replied. You learn patience doing that. We reached the car and Margaret opened the passenger door for me. Before I stepped inside, I turned and looked back toward the reception tent in the distance. From here the music sounded faint, almost like a memory drifting across the vineyard. Adrian was still inside that tent, beginning a new life, just not the one he had expected. As Margaret drove us back toward town, the sky slowly turned shades of orange and purple. I watched the road quietly, thinking about the strange journey life had taken me on. Years ago, I believed the greatest gift a mother could give her child was everything she had built, every dollar saved, every sacrifice made. But somewhere along the way, I realized something deeper. The greatest gift a parent can give is not wealth, it's wisdom. And sometimes wisdom only arrives when comfort disappears. A few days after the wedding, something else important happened. Margaret called me early one morning while I was drinking tea by the window. Evelyn, she said, her voice carrying a hint of excitement. You remember the Grace Haven Foundation? I smiled immediately. Of course. Grace Haven had always been close to my heart. It was a place that helped elderly women who had been abandoned by family members. Women who had spent their lives caring for others only to find themselves alone later in life. The director would like to meet you, Margaret said. His name is Pastor Daniel Brooks. I agreed right away. Later that afternoon, Margaret drove me to the foundation building just outside the city. It wasn't a grand place like the vineyard where Adrian had celebrated his wedding, but it had something far more meaningful: warmth. When Pastor Daniel Brooks greeted us at the door, his expression carried genuine kindness. He was a tall man with calm eyes and the kind of presence that made people feel comfortable immediately. Mrs. Carter, he said warmly, shaking my hand, we're deeply honored by your generosity. I shook my head gently. It isn't generosity, I replied. It's simply giving something back. Pastor Brooks walked us through the building slowly. In the common room, several elderly women were sitting together talking and laughing while someone served tea from a large kettle. One of them looked up and smiled at me as we passed. In that moment, I understood exactly why the decision I had made felt so right. These women reminded me of something important. Life isn't measured by how much wealth we pass down to the next generation. It's measured by how much kindness we leave behind in the world. Pastor Brooks turned to me as we reached the garden behind the building. Your donation will allow us to expand this place, he said. More rooms, better medical care, more support for women who truly need it. I looked around at the peaceful little garden where several residents were watering flowers and enjoying the sunshine. Then it was worth it, I said softly. Margaret stood quietly beside me, smiling with the quiet pride of someone who had watched a difficult decision turn into something meaningful. Weeks passed after that day. Life returned to its normal rhythm. I continued living in my small house, drinking tea by the window and sewing small projects for neighbors who still came by from time to time. But something unexpected happened one evening near the end of summer. There was a knock at my front door. When I opened it, Adrian was standing there. He looked different than he had on his wedding day, less polished, less confident, more thoughtful. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Finally, he said quietly, "Mom, can we talk?" I stepped aside and let him enter. We sat at the same kitchen table where Margaret and I had rewritten my will weeks earlier. Adrian looked around the room slowly, noticing the sewing machine, the old wooden chest, and the quiet simplicity of the home where he had grown up. "I didn't understand," he said after a moment. I poured 2 cups of tea and placed one in front of him. "Understand what?" I asked gently. "Everything," he admitted. "The work you did, the sacrifices you made. I was so busy trying to look successful that I forgot what success actually meant." His words were quiet, but they were honest. And sometimes honesty is the first step toward becoming a better person. I reached across the table and placed my hand over his. "Life has a way of teaching us lessons," I said softly. Adrian nodded slowly. "Vanessa and I have been arguing ever since the wedding," he admitted. "She still thinks you humiliated us." I smiled slightly. "Did I?" Adrian shook his head. "No," he said. "You showed me something I should have seen years ago." For the first time in a long while, I saw the boy I had raised shining through the man sitting across from me, not the marketing executive, not the image-focused professional. Just my son, and that moment reminded me of the most important truth of all. Sometimes the lessons we give our children hurt in the moment, but those same lessons can also help them grow into better people. Adrian finished his tea and stood slowly. "Thank you for letting me come tonight," he said quietly. I walked him to the door and watched as he stepped out into the evening air. Before leaving, he turned back toward me. "Mom, yes," he said, "I'm proud of you." I smiled gently. "I'm proud of you too," I replied. After he left, I returned to my chair near the window. The street outside was quiet, the soft glow of the streetlight illuminating the empty road. For the first time in a long while, my heart felt completely at peace. Because sometimes the greatest victory in life isn't winning an argument or proving someone wrong. Sometimes the greatest victory is simply reminding people what truly matters: love, respect, and the quiet strength of a mother who refuses to disappear. And if this story reminded you that kindness and dignity always matter, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Because sometimes the quietest stories carry the strongest lessons.